Justice, junkyard dog. He spat the words across the chamber, reducing Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett to nothing more than a mutt in his eyes. But insults don't erase truth. They ignite it. In the past 12 months, over 500 hours of hearings have been broadcast to the American people. Most are forgotten. This one will not. Because tonight, Jasmine Crockett is not just a woman under attack. She is the line between justice and betrayal, standing toe-to-toe with the sitting president of the United States, Donald J. Trump. And when a president dares to threaten a foreign ally with replacement, when he toys with democracy like a pawn on his chessboard, the world watches. What begins here is more than politics. It's the fight to decide whether power silences justice or justice finally silences power. The chamber doors closed with a thunderous echo, and the room fell into a silence that felt like 1,000 eyes holding their breath. Every camera was live, every microphone was open. The air was heavy, not with ceremony, but with the tension of a battlefield waiting for its first shot. And Jasmine Crockett was that shot. She didn't wait for pleasantries, didn't wait for introductions. She rose, her hands steady on the stack of papers before her, and her voice, sharp, clear, unshaken, cut through the hush like a blade. "Earlier this morning," she declared, each word measured, burning with restrained fury, "the President of the United States, Donald J. Trump, told President Volodymyr Zelenskyy of Ukraine, 'If you do not give land to Putin, I will replace you with another president.'" It was not a statement. It was an explosion. The chamber froze. The room, filled with lawmakers who had weathered scandals, wars, and betrayals, now sat paralyzed. For a moment, the entire Congress seemed to forget how to breathe. A rustle of shock spread like a wave, gasps from the public gallery, whispers from the aides, clenched jaws from stunned legislators. The camera zoomed in, faces drained of color, men and women who had spent their careers defending their parties, now caught in the headlights of a truth so raw it burned. Some shook their heads in disbelief. Others avoided eye contact, as if looking down could shield them from the weight of her words. But no one could hide. Not from this. Trump sat back in his chair, his smirk faltering for the first time. His hands tightened on the armrests, knuckles whitening as if gripping onto the last fragments of control. And Jasmine's eyes, fierce and unwavering, locked on him like a predator who had just cornered her prey. "This," she continued, her voice rising, echoing off marble walls, "is not foreign policy. This is blackmail. This is betrayal. This is the President of the United States threatening a democratically elected ally, promising to topple a sovereign leader in favor of one who will obey his will and serve the interests of Vladimir Putin." Her words fell like hammers, one by one, each syllable pounding against the chest of every man and woman in that chamber. The silence that followed was unbearable. You could almost hear the hearts beating, the pens scratching nervously across paper, the uneasy coughs of those who wished desperately for this moment to pass. But it did not pass. It lingered, heavy, suffocating, because there was no going back. The cameras cut across the room. A senator stared wide-eyed, lips parted in shock. A congresswoman covered her mouth, whispering a prayer. The chairman shifted in his seat, visibly rattled, his gavel trembling in his hand. The nation was watching, every second broadcasted live, every heartbeat of this scandal shared with millions of homes across America. And in those homes, veterans, widows, workers, mothers, men and women who had seen too much of this world, leaned closer to their screens. They knew what betrayal looked like. They had lived through lies, but to hear it so plainly, so brazenly, from their president, it was almost too much to comprehend. Trump leaned forward, his face flushing crimson, his mouth tightening into a snarl. He looked ready to pounce, to hurl his counterattack, to dismiss it all as fiction. But Jasmine didn't flinch. She didn't yield. She let the silence hold. Let the words sink into the skin of every lawmaker until they could no longer deny what they had just heard. And then she placed the paper down, slow and deliberate, the sound of it hitting wood like the crack of a judge's gavel. "This," she said, her voice steady, almost cold now, "is the truth. And the truth, no matter how ugly, no matter how dangerous, does not disappear simply because power commands it to. The audience stirred again, not with whispers this time, but with murmurs that carried weight. Disbelief was turning to anger. Fear was hardening into outrage. The chamber was no longer just a room. It was a crucible. And in its fire, Jasmine Crockett had just thrown in the most dangerous spark of all. The accusation that the President of the United States had tried to overthrow a foreign democracy for his own gain. Trump's smirk was gone. His jaw clenched. His eyes narrowed into daggers. But the damage was already done. The narrative had shifted. The world wasn't asking if Jasmine Crockett was telling the truth. The world was asking if their president had truly promised to replace another nation's leader to please Vladimir Putin. And as the weight of that question pressed down on the chamber, as history itself paused to take note, one thing was certain. The hearing was no longer just a political procedure. It was a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett had fired the first shot. Trump leaned forward, and for a split second the chamber thought he might explode. But instead he smiled. A crooked, smug curve of the lips that had silenced rooms and manipulated crowds for years. His voice, low and deliberate, slithered through the silence Jasmine left behind. "I only told the truth," he said, pausing just long enough for the cameras to capture every syllable. "Ukraine needs a leader who knows how to listen. That's it." Gasps rippled through the chamber. He had not denied it. He had not even tried. Instead, he cloaked the threat in the velvet of justification, turning a crime into what he called common sense. For a moment, the room fractured into chaos. Some lawmakers muttered angrily under their breath. Others clapped their hands over their faces, stunned at the audacity. Staffers scribbled furiously, phones lit up across the gallery, and a storm of whispers turned into a low, thunderous roar. The man at the center of it all, Donald J. Trump, leaned back in his chair, as though the noise were a symphony written for him alone. He basked in it, his eyes glinting with a predator's delight. Jasmine didn't move. Her gaze stayed locked on him, her expression frozen between fury and disbelief. She had fired the first shot, but Trump had caught it in his bare hands and dared the world to call him guilty. The chairman slammed the gavel once, twice, a third time. "Order!" he shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. The uproar dulled, but the tension did not. Trump leaned into the microphone again, savoring the attention. His voice dropped, but the microphones amplified the arrogance until it filled every corner of the room. "Do you want peace?" he asked, almost sweetly. "Because peace doesn't come from stubborn men who refuse to listen. Peace comes from strength. Peace comes from leaders who understand when to stop fighting battles they cannot win." The words dripped with venom disguised as wisdom. He wasn't denying coercion. He wasn't apologizing. He was justifying betrayal as if it were statesmanship. Cameras panned to lawmakers who shifted uncomfortably in their seats. A handful of Trump's loyal allies nodded along, mouthing approval, their eyes shining with the same cold certainty. But across the aisle, others sat rigid, fists clenched, their faces tight with rage. Jasmine finally spoke. Her voice was softer than before, but every syllable carved its way through the noise. "So what you're saying, Mr. President," she began, her eyes narrowing, "is that when an ally refuses to surrender their freedom, your solution is to replace their leader. That is your definition of peace?" Trump didn't flinch. He smirked. The smirk of a man who believed he was untouchable. "Sometimes," he said slowly, savoring the weight of the moment, "leaders must be replaced for the greater good." The chamber erupted again. Shouts of outrage clashed with cries of support. The gavel pounded, useless against the tidal wave of fury and disbelief. Reporters scrambled in their seats, firing messages that would light up headlines within minutes. Sometimes leaders must be replaced. The phrase hung in the air, poisonous and permanent, already branded into history. Jasmine pressed forward, her tone sharpening. "And who gave you the authority to decide which leaders are worthy of serving their people? Who gave you the right to play kingmaker over a free and sovereign nation?" Her words struck with surgical precision. The audience hushed. Even Trump's allies leaned in, waiting for his response. He tilted his head, his eyes glimmering with defiance. "The world gave me that right," he declared, "because when America speaks, the world listens. And right now, The world needs me to make decisions others are too weak to face. It was raw, unfiltered arrogance, the kind that turned every ally into a pawn, the kind that blurred the line between leadership and tyranny, and the kind that made even his defenders hesitate. One congressman in the back row shifted uncomfortably, his face pale. Another whispered something to her aide, her eyes wide with disbelief. Jasmine let the silence linger again, letting his words rot in the air. Then she leaned forward, her voice cutting through like steel. "You're not talking about peace, Mr. President. You're talking about power. And you've just admitted in front of the American people that you would tear down a democracy to please Vladimir Putin." Her accusation hit like lightning. The chamber shook with the force of it. Lawmakers shouting, reporters rushing, the gavel pounding in vain. Trump's jaw clenched, but he didn't retreat. Instead, he spread his arms wide as if to embrace the chaos. "Yes," he roared over the din, "because no one else has the courage to do what needs to be done." The declaration echoed through the chamber like a battle cry. It was not the voice of a president defending policy. It was the voice of a man proclaiming himself above law, above allies, above the very idea of democracy. And as the cameras captured every second, as millions of Americans watched in disbelief, the truth became undeniable. Jasmine Crockett had drawn the first blood, but Donald Trump, arrogant and unrepentant, had just poured gasoline onto the fire. The reckoning was no longer a distant storm. It was here, and it was about to consume everything. Jasmine Crockett did not hesitate. With the chamber still trembling from Trump's brazen words, she reached into her folder and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with the stamp of the House Intelligence Committee. The paper rustled as she laid it on the desk before her, the sound magnified by the silence now choking the room. Every eye turned toward her. Every camera zoomed in. And then she spoke. "This committee," she began, her voice steady, "has in its possession documents classified at the highest level. What I hold in my hand is not rumor, not speculation, not partisan theater. It is evidence. Evidence of a plan drafted, named, and endorsed by the President of the United States himself." She paused, letting the suspense coil around her words. "A plan," she continued, lifting the folder, "called Operation New Dawn." The chamber erupted. Gasps. Shouts. Chairs scraped the marble floor as lawmakers twisted in their seats. Reporters leaned forward, their fingers flying across keyboards, their whispers colliding into a storm of speculation. Trump's face twitched. For the first time that evening, his smile cracked. Jasmine flipped open the file. Pages stamped top secret slid into view, thick with signatures, coded memos, and handwritten notes. She held one page high so the cameras could see the bold black letters at the top. Operation New Dawn. Her voice rose above the din. This plan outlines direct communications between President Trump's office and pro-Russian factions in Ukraine. Communications designed to replace President Zelenskyy with a government handpicked to serve Moscow's interests and Mr. Trump's. The noise inside the chamber was like thunder rolling through the mountains. Some lawmakers stood in shock, clutching their desks. Others shouted accusations across the aisle, their voices drowned in the growing uproar. The chairman slammed his gavel again and again, but order was impossible. The storm was out of his control now. Jasmine pressed forward, her words cutting through the chaos like lightning. "These are not unverified leaks. They are authenticated cables, diplomatic transcripts, signed directives. Your name is on them, Mr. President." Her hand slammed the desk, rattling the microphone. "Your name!" Trump shot forward in his chair, his face red, his voice shaking with fury. "Lies, all of it. Forged papers, fake signatures, the same garbage they've always thrown at me." But his tone betrayed him. It was too sharp, too desperate. The cameras lingered on his clenched fists, the sweat beading on his forehead. Jasmine did not look away. She raised another page, this one a memo stamped with the date of his meeting with Zelenskyy. She read aloud, her voice clear, deliberate. "Contingency plan. Should Zelenskyy refuse to negotiate territorial concessions, initiate political transition through allied Ukrainian faction. Replace leadership swiftly. Ensure Kremlin approval before announcement." The words echoed like cannon fire across the chamber. Reporters gasped audibly. Lawmakers covered their mouths. One elderly senator, his hands trembling, muttered, "My God," under his breath. And still Jasmine pressed on. This is not strategy. This is sabotage. This is the President of the United States plotting regime change in a sovereign ally to satisfy Vladimir Putin's demands. She dropped the page onto the desk, the sound like a hammer striking steel. The chamber roared. Some cried treason. Others shouted fraud. Allies of Trump leapt to their feet, waving their hands, demanding the documents be dismissed as fabrications. But the words were already out. They could not be pulled back. Trump tried to rise, his mouth open in protest, but the noise of the chamber swallowed him whole. His voice, once commanding, now fought against a tide too strong to control. Jasmine did not let him reclaim the moment. She leaned into the microphone, her face lit by the glow of the cameras. You have just told this chamber that sometimes leaders must be replaced. And now, Mr. President, the world sees exactly how far you were willing to go to make that happen. This isn't about peace. This is about power. Your power, Putin's power, and the destruction of democracy in the process. Her words struck like daggers, each one sharper than the last. In the gallery above, a ripple of applause broke out. Small at first, then quickly silenced by guards, but loud enough to be heard, loud enough to remind everyone in the chamber that the people were watching, the people were listening, and they were not fooled. Trump's eyes darted around the room, searching for allies, for nods of reassurance, for some sign that he still held sway. But what he saw instead was doubt, fear, and in some faces, betrayal. The cameras caught it all. The nation saw not just a president under fire, but a man unraveling in real time, exposed by documents he could not bury, and a congresswoman he could not intimidate. The storm was no longer building. It had broken wide open. And as Jasmine closed the folder with deliberate calm, her final words of the moment cut through the chaos like a verdict. Operation New Dawn is not a sunrise. It is a funeral for democracy. And you, Mr. President, dug the grave. The chamber erupted like a battlefield. But in the eye of that storm, Jasmine Crockett stood unshaken, her hand still resting on the folder that had just shattered the illusion of power. The reckoning had begun in whispers. Now it thundered across the world. Lies! All of it! The voice came like a cannon blast from the Republican side of the chamber. A tall congressman, his face red with rage, shot to his feet, his fingers stabbing the air at Jasmine Crockett. His voice boomed over the din. This is fabrication, a coup in disguise. Nothing but a scheme to bring down our president. The chamber rippled with noise, allies of Trump pounding their desks, shouting in unison. A wall of sound meant to drown out the evidence, to shake the foundations of the hearing itself. The chairman's gavel cracked against wood, again and again, desperate to restore control. But the storm had its own rhythm now, and no gavel could silence it. Through the chaos, Jasmine stood perfectly still. Her eyes locked on the congressman, unblinking, cold as iron. She waited until his voice began to break, until the roar of his defiance turned hoarse. Then she spoke, and her words sliced through the chamber like glass through flesh. They only call it a conspiracy, she said, her tone sharp and deliberate, when there is no proof. But here... She lifted the folder, her fingers tightening on the edges. I have proof in abundance. The room trembled with her defiance. The congressman faltered, his mouth still open, but his words lost, swallowed by the precision of her reply. The camera zoomed in, catching every flicker of fear in his eyes, every bead of sweat crawling down his temple. Jasmine pressed forward. This is not theater. These are not rumors. These documents are signed, sealed, and authenticated. Pages marked top secret, bearing the president's own approval. Do you call that fabrication? She held up a page, the seal of the office of the president visible beneath glaring fluorescent lights. The gallery gasped. The nation, watching live, leaned closer to their screens. Trump shifted uneasily, his fists clenching tighter, his eyes darting between his allies as if to command them to speak louder, to shield him with their noise. And louder they tried. Another Republican shouted, "It's forged!" A third bellowed, "She should be censured. Remove her from this hearing." The chamber became a battlefield of sound, voices colliding, accusations flying, the walls themselves shaking under the weight of history being torn open. But Jasmine did not retreat. Her voice rose above them all, sharp and unwavering. Every time the truth is spoken in this chamber, it is met with screams. Every time evidence is shown, it is buried under denial. But the American people are watching, and they can see the louder you shout, the more guilty you sound. The silence that followed was brutal. Her words hung in the air, undeniable, undeniable, undeniable. Even Trump's fiercest defenders hesitated, their eyes flicking nervously toward the cameras, aware that every second of their rage was being recorded, broadcast, immortalized. Jasmine stepped forward, her hand still clutching the damning file. This is not about party. This is not about politics. This is about a president who conspired with a foreign power to dismantle democracy. You can shout, you can scream, but you cannot erase ink on a page. You cannot erase his own signature. She slammed the file shut, the sound reverberating through the chamber like the crack of a rifle. Trump's allies flinched. The congressman who had first accused her of staging a coup tried to recover, his voice trembling now. This is outrageous. You are undermining the commander-in-chief. You're handing our enemies ammunition. Jasmine's gaze pierced him like a blade. No, she said, her tone dropping to a cold whisper that somehow carried across the entire hall. He is handing our enemies ammunition. I am taking it away. The chamber gasped again, the gallery erupting in murmurs. Her words hit harder than fists, sharper than any weapon. The congressman sat down, his face pale, his defiance drained. Trump stared at her, his eyes blazing with fury, his chest heaving. But for all his rage, for all the shouts of his defenders, the tide was shifting. The world was seeing the truth, not a conspiracy, not a scheme, but a mountain of evidence, a storm of betrayal, and a president exposed. Jasmine Crockett stood tall, her shoulders squared, her voice echoing with the weight of history. Call it what you will, she declared, conspiracy, coup, witch hunt. But the truth does not bow to insults. And tonight, the truth belongs to the American people. The chamber erupted once more, but this time the sound was not only rage, it was panic, it was fear. It was the sound of walls cracking under pressure, and in the middle of it all, Jasmine did not flinch. She had turned their accusations into confession. She had turned their shouting into silence, and the storm only grew. Then suddenly the lights dimmed. The chamber, already heavy with tension, seemed to sink into darkness. Whispers spread like fire. Staffers glancing nervously, reporters craning their necks, lawmakers shifting in their seats. From behind a curtain at the side of the hall, a figure emerged. Not a politician, not a familiar face, but a man dressed in the plain suit of a civil servant, his shoulders stiff, his hands clenched, as if every step forward was an act of war. A murmur rose. Who is that? What's happening? Is this? The chairman struck his gavel once, but even he looked uncertain. The man stopped at the microphone, the shadows still clinging to his face. His voice trembled at first, but steadied with each word, carrying the weight of a confession that could shatter nations. I am a member of the U.S. diplomatic delegation, he said, his eyes scanning the chamber, and I was in the room when the president spoke to President Zelenskyy. The silence was absolute. No coughs, no whispers, not even the scratching of pens. The chamber held its breath. And then he continued, I heard it with my own ears. President Trump said, if you do not give land to Putin, I will see to it you are replaced with someone who will. Gasps tore through the gallery. A senator's jaw dropped. A congresswoman pressed her hand to her chest. Reporters pounded at their laptops like drummers, racing to capture every syllable. Trump shot to his feet. Liar, he barked, his voice cracking with fury. Who put you up to this? Who the hell are you? The witness did not flinch. His voice grew firmer, stronger. And I heard something else. The president told Zelenskyy that Vladimir Putin was, and I quote, the only friend who can bring true peace. The chamber exploded. The words ricocheted off marble walls, sinking into the ears of every American watching at home. The President of the United States calling Vladimir Putin his only friend of peace. Trump's allies leapt to their feet, screaming. Some pounded their desks, others pointed fingers, their rage flailing like fists in the dark. But their noise couldn't bury what had just been said. It couldn't erase the image of a president aligning himself with the man who had waged war, spilled blood, and torn nations apart. The witness's hands trembled, but his eyes burned. "I took an oath to serve my country," he said, his voice rising above the cacophony. "And today, that oath means telling you what I heard. It means telling the American people the truth, no matter the cost." Trump slammed a fist against the table, his face twisted with desperation. "This is treason. This is a witch hunt with actors, cowards. Nobody's paraded as witnesses." But the word treason lingered in the air like smoke. Only it clung not to the witness, but to him. Jasmine Crockett stepped closer, her eyes locked on the man behind the microphone. "You understand the risk you take by speaking these words under oath?" The witness nodded, his voice steady now, cut clean through the chamber. "I do. But silence would be the greater risk. Silence would be surrender." The gallery stirred, a ripple of emotion moving through the crowd. Some wiped tears, others whispered prayers, all united by the weight of what they had just heard. Jasmine turned, her voice carrying the gravitas of judgment. "You've heard it from his own mouth. You've seen it in the documents. And now you hear it from a man who stood in that room. The President of the United States threatened to topple an ally's government and praised Vladimir Putin as his only true friend." Her words wrapped around the chamber, binding it in truth, leaving no escape. Trump's face flushed deep red, his breathing heavy. He tried to speak, but the roar of the chamber drowned him out. The gavel pounded, reporters shouted questions. The gallery erupted with cries of disbelief and outrage. And through it all, the witness stood still, a single figure, nameless, faceless in the shadows, but carrying the kind of truth that could bring an empire to its knees. History would not remember his name, but it would remember his words. And the storm Jasmine Crockett had unleashed, now had a voice, not just hers, not just paper and ink, but a living witness, trembling yet unbroken, daring to speak truth to the most powerful man in the world. The reckoning deepened, and for the first time, Donald J. Trump looked like a man staring into the abyss of his own downfall. The silence shattered with a thunderous crack. Trump slammed his fist on the table, the sound ricocheting off marble walls like a gunshot. The microphone screeched, the cameras jolted, and the chamber recoiled as his voice tore through the uproar. "Bring him into the light," he roared, his face contorted, his finger stabbing toward the shadowed witness. "This man is a fraud, a plant, a coward, a liar dressed up to destroy me." The words didn't calm the storm. They fed it. Every syllable fanned the flames. Every accusation splintered into more chaos. Lawmakers shouted over one another, some demanding the witness reveal his identity, others calling Trump's outburst an act of desperation. The chairman's gavel pounded, a staccato beat against the riot of voices. "Order! Order!" But order was a corpse in this chamber now. The gallery erupted. Voices from above crying out in shock, disbelief, fury. Reporters leaned forward, their pens scratching furiously, their cameras flashing, capturing the image of a president undone by his own rage. Trump rose from his chair, his face crimson, sweat rolling down his temple. He slammed the desk again, his voice ragged but defiant. "You hide him in shadows because he's not real. You hide him because he has no name, no courage. You parade this phantom, this nobody, and call it truth." The witness stood still, unflinching, the curtain's shadow still cloaking half his face, but his voice, quiet and steady, pierced the chaos. "I am real, and I heard you, Mr. President. I heard every word." The chamber gasped. Trump snarled, pounding the table once more. "You're lying, a puppet, bought and paid for by my enemies. You're not a witness. You're a disgrace to this country." But his fury was no longer commanding. It was desperate, frantic, like a man clawing at the walls of a collapsing cell. Jasmine Crockett did not move. She let him rage. Let his voice ricochet off the walls and fall into the pit of his own unraveling. When she finally spoke, her voice was low but cutting, a blade sliding through the din. "Mr. President, every time you scream, You reveal yourself. Every time you rage, you confess. The louder you shout, the clearer the truth becomes. Her words struck like a whip. Trump froze, his mouth still open, the chamber's noise settling into a tense, electric hush. For a moment, he looked less like a president and more like a man stripped bare. His bluster no longer a shield but a mirror reflecting his fear. He tried again, softer now but trembling with venom. This is an ambush, a setup. You want to ruin me and you'll destroy this country in the process. That's the real crime here. But the chamber no longer leaned toward him. The balance had shifted. Lawmakers whispered urgently among themselves, eyes darting between the witness, Jasmine, and the enraged figure of the president. The cameras captured every second, feeding the American people the image of a leader cornered and lashing out like a trapped animal. The witness lifted his chin, his voice steady as stone. You can call me what you wish, but I know what I heard, and so does God. You told Zelenskyy that Putin was the only friend of peace, that you would replace him if he refused you. That is the truth, and no scream can erase it. Trump's breath came heavy, ragged. His knuckles blanched white against the desk. For the first time in years, the master of spectacle, the man who had turned chaos into theater, no longer controlled the stage. The theater was controlling him. The chairman, his voice trembling, finally managed to restore a semblance of order. Mr. President, you will compose yourself. This is a congressional hearing, not a campaign rally. But Trump did not hear him. His glare fixed on Jasmine, burning with fury, as though she alone had conjured this nightmare into being. You think you've cornered me, he spat, his voice low and venomous. You think you've got your perfect little show. But this is nothing. Nothing. I will not be destroyed by lies. Jasmine's gaze never wavered. She leaned into her microphone, her voice calm, unhurried, but lethal in its precision. Lies, she said softly, don't come with signatures. Lies don't come with transcripts. Lies don't come with witnesses who risk everything to speak. The only lie in this room, Mr. President, is the one you keep telling yourself, that you are untouchable. The chamber shook with murmurs, the gallery rippling with emotion. Reporters scribbled the line as if it were history itself. Trump's lips curled into a snarl, but no words came. His chest rose and fell, the fury inside him colliding with the reality he could no longer escape. The storm raged on, but now for the first time, it was clear who was being carried away by its tide. And it wasn't Jasmine Crockett. Jasmine waited. The chamber was still vibrating from Trump's fury, his words hanging in the air like smoke after an explosion. The witness remained in the shadows, his silence now a defiant shield. And then, with deliberate calm, Jasmine reached for a small black remote. The screens lining the chamber flickered. A hush fell. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the hum of the projectors warming up. Then the image appeared. A grainy but unmistakable video. A long conference table, chandeliers overhead, the seal of the United States faint in the corner of the frame. And there, seated at the head, leaning forward, his hands spread wide, was Donald J. Trump. The chamber froze. No narration, no commentary, just the raw footage. Trump's voice filled the room, cold, measured, laced with arrogance. Ukraine can have peace tomorrow, he said, his tone dripping with calculated menace. All it takes is a new president. The chamber erupted like a powder keg. Gas tore through the room. Lawmakers shot to their feet, some clutching their chests, others shouting in disbelief. The gallery thundered with cries of outrage and shock, the noise crashing like waves against stone walls. Reporters scrambled, typing furiously, their phones lighting up with frantic calls. Headlines were already being written. Trump caught on video demanding regime change. Trump himself went pale. For the first time all night, his fury faltered, his bluster cracked. His mouth opened as if to speak, but no words came. The image of his own face on screen, his own voice echoing in the chamber, was a mirror he could not shatter. Jasmine did not gloat. She didn't need to. She stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on the screen, her silence louder than any speech she could deliver. The video played on. Trump leaned closer to Zelenskyy, his voice sharp, commanding. You want America's support? Then step aside. We'll find someone else who knows how to listen. Someone who understands what real peace looks like. The words cut through the chamber like daggers. Lawmakers shouted over one another. Unbelievable! This is treason! How dare he? One senator, his face white as parchment, collapsed back into his chair, shaking his head. Another, unable to contain her rage, pointed at the screen and screamed, "You threatened him! You threatened him!" The chairman's gavel pounded desperately, but the chamber was beyond control. It was chaos. Raw, unfiltered, unstoppable. Trump slammed his fists against the desk, his voice cracking as he bellowed, "That video is doctored, a fake, a fraud created by enemies of the state." But his protest was drowned by the sound of his own voice looping again on the screen. Ukraine can have peace tomorrow. All it takes is a new president. The repetition was devastating. Every time the words played, the chamber shuddered, the truth hammering deeper, inescapable. Jasmine finally stepped forward. Her voice, steady and razor-sharp, sliced through the chaos. "Mr. President, the American people don't need to take my word. They don't need to take this witness's word. Tonight they hear it from you, your voice, your threat, your betrayal." The camera zoomed in on her face, calm, resolute, burning with quiet fury. This is not leadership. This is extortion. This is the language of tyrants, and it came from the President of the United States. The chamber gasped as her words collided with the video still frozen on the screens. Trump's face caught mid-sneer, his eyes narrowed, his mouth twisted in the shape of the word president. Trump shook his head violently, his voice breaking as he tried again. "It's out of context, out of context. I was talking about corruption, not peace. Corruption. You twist everything I say." But even as he spoke, his eyes darted nervously toward the cameras, toward the millions of viewers at home who weren't parsing context. They were hearing his words as plain as day. In living rooms across America, families sat stunned. Veterans clenched their fists. Mothers wiped tears from their eyes. Retired workers shook their heads in disbelief. The man who had sworn an oath to defend democracy had threatened to dismantle it. And now the entire nation had heard him say it. Jasmine let the silence settle. Let the weight of the video crush the chamber under its truth. Then she spoke again, her voice low, steady, final. "You said Ukraine could have peace tomorrow. But what you offered was not peace. It was surrender. It was betrayal. It was the price of bowing to Vladimir Putin." Her words hung heavy, like a verdict. Trump sank into his chair, his chest heaving, his face twisted in rage and fear. His allies shouted still, but their voices were hollow, frantic, desperate echoes against the undeniable. The chamber was no longer debating, it was witnessing, and history itself was recording every second. The chamber was still vibrating from the thunder of voices, but Jasmine Crockett did not raise hers. She stood in the storm and spoke with calm so sharp it sliced deeper than any scream. "You call this peace," she said, her tone measured, steady, almost chilling in its restraint. "But I call it what it is, a blatant coup." The words fell like ice water on the chamber. The noise died instantly. Dozens of lawmakers froze mid-shout, their hands still raised, their mouths half open. Reporters stopped typing mid-sentence, pens hovering in the air. Even the gallery, moments before roaring with disbelief, fell into an eerie silence. All eyes turned to the man at the center of it all, the president. Trump's face flushed crimson, his jaw tight, his eyes darting wildly across the chamber as if searching for an escape. For the first time all night, he found none. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Seconds passed, long, agonizing, historic seconds, where the most powerful man in the world sat in silence, caught between fury and fear. The cameras zoomed in on his face. The entire nation was watching the president's silence. And in that silence, Jasmine pressed forward. "Peace," she continued, her voice unwavering, "does not come from threats. It does not come from installing puppets. It does not come from bowing to Moscow. What you offered was not peace. It was surrender. What you demanded was not compromise. It was a coup against a free and sovereign ally." Her words echoed against the marble walls, calm yet devastating, each syllable hammering deeper than Trump's shouting ever could. In the stillness that followed, Trump shifted in his chair, his hands clenching into fists, his lips curled into a grimace, but still, no answer. The silence grew heavier. It was not the silence of control. It was the silence of defeat. Lawmakers leaned forward in their seats, stunned at the sight. Some exchanged glances, wide-eyed, whispering to one another. A senator covered her mouth with trembling fingers. The gallery murmured, voices low but urgent, as if afraid to break the spell. Trump's entire career had been built on never yielding ground, on never allowing silence to expose him. But now, on live television, he sat speechless. And Jasmine Crockett seized the moment. She leaned closer to the microphone, her eyes locked on him, her voice soft but merciless. "You said Ukraine could have peace tomorrow," she said, almost like a teacher scolding a reckless child. "But the cost you demanded was democracy itself. You said leaders must sometimes be replaced. But the only leader who needs replacing is the one sitting before us now." The chamber gasped. A wave of murmurs cascaded through the room, crashing against the walls. Some lawmakers covered their faces, others looked around, as if history itself had just shifted under their feet. Trump's hands trembled against the desk. He shook his head, muttering under his breath, but the microphones caught nothing coherent. His silence was louder than his shouts, and Jasmine did not let go. She lifted the folder marked Operation New Dawn, holding it up once more for all to see. "This," she declared, "is not foreign policy. This is not negotiation. This is not strength. This is an attempted coup, conceived in secrecy, spoken aloud in arrogance, and exposed tonight under oath and on video." She lowered the file onto the desk, her voice hardening into steel. "And the only reason it failed is because President Zelenskyy did not surrender to you, because Ukraine did not bow, because the truth has a way of surviving even the most powerful lies." The chamber erupted in a mixture of gasps, applause, and shouts. The chairman's gavel cracked against the wood, but even he could not mask the seismic shift happening in real time. The storm had turned. Trump sat hunched, his once commanding posture broken, his silence betraying him more than his words ever could. The cameras devoured the image, feeding it to millions watching at home. The president, cornered, silenced, undone by his own arrogance. And Jasmine, calm, fierce, unflinching, stood as the immovable force, her presence filling the chamber like a verdict carved into stone. She glanced at the silent man across from her and delivered the final blow of the moment. "You can shout tomorrow. You can rage tomorrow. But tonight the silence tells the truth. And the truth is this: you tried to topple a democracy, and you failed." The gallery erupted, some cheering, others shouting, the noise crashing against the fragile order of the chamber. Reporters scrambled, their headlines already shaping the future. Crockett calls Trump's peace a coup. And still, Trump had no answer. Only silence. Only the look of a man who, for the first time, could not find words to save himself. And then, out of the silence, another voice rose. Not Jasmine's, not Trump's, but from the Republican side of the chamber. A man in a dark suit stood slowly, his hands trembling as he adjusted his glasses. He was not a partisan firebrand, not a constant presence on television. He was known as steady, pragmatic, a moderate who avoided spectacle. But his voice now was heavy, solemn, weighted with history. "If what we have heard tonight is true," he said, his words ringing clear in the chamber, "then this is a betrayal that cannot be forgiven." The entire hall gasped. It was not a Democrat speaking. It was not an opponent. It was one of Trump's own, a Republican. The crack of thunder rolled through the chamber, invisible but undeniable. The split was here. Trump's head snapped around, his eyes blazing like fire. His fingers stabbed through the air toward the man who had dared to stand. "You!" Trump hissed, his voice low but shaking with fury. "You dare betray me? You, after everything I've done? After everything I've given?" The lawmaker's face was pale, but he did not sit. His voice wavered for only a moment before it found steel. "I took an oath to this country, not to you, not to Vladimir Putin. And if the President of the United States threatened to topple an ally's government for Moscow's gain, then it is not loyalty to oppose it. It is duty." The chamber erupted again, a storm of shouts and cries, but this time the noise had shifted. It wasn't only Democrats hurling accusations. It wasn't only Republicans defending blindly. The room was splitting. Lines once carved in stone now blurred, fractured, breaking under the unbearable weight of truth. Trump's face twisted with rage, his lips curling into a snarl. He leaned forward, his voice booming into the microphone, shaking with venom. "You're weak. You're spineless. Without me, you are nothing. You'd have no seat, no voice, no future without me. And this is how you repay me." The lawmaker didn't flinch. He lifted his chin, his voice steady. "I don't answer to you. I answer to the people. And they deserve the truth." Gas rippled through the chamber. The cameras panned, capturing the standoff. Trump's eyes burning with betrayal, the congressman's posture rigid, his jaw clenched with conviction. And across the aisle, Jasmine Crockett watched in silence, her face unreadable. But her eyes glimmered with the knowledge that the wall around Trump was beginning to crack. Trump slammed his fist on the desk again, his voice breaking into a roar. "Traitor! You are a traitor to your party, to your president, to everything we stand for." But the word traitor did not stick. It boomeranged back, heavier, sharper, as lawmakers murmured to one another, whispering the same word. But about him. The gallery above stirred, voices rising in disbelief. Some shouted support for the Republican who had spoken. Others hurled curses at Trump. But the chamber was no longer united against Jasmine. It was dividing against itself. Jasmine seized the moment. She leaned into her microphone, her voice calm, almost gentle. "This is what happens when truth enters a room. It does not divide us, it reveals us. Tonight, we see who bows to power and who stands for principle." The chamber stilled again, her words piercing through the storm. The Republican lawmaker sat slowly, his face grim but resolute. His silence now spoke louder than the shouting of Trump's loyalists. And Trump, his face flushed, his hair damp with sweat, glared at him with the kind of fury that could set stone on fire. "You will regret this," he snarled, his voice low, almost a growl. "You will regret crossing me." But the threat sounded hollow. The cameras caught not the menace of a strong man, but the desperation of a man watching his empire fracture before his eyes. For years, his party had been his shield, his fortress. Now the cracks were spreading. And Jasmine Crockett, standing firm at the center of the storm, knew it. She turned back to the president, her voice quiet, but lethal in its precision. "You said sometimes leaders must be replaced. Perhaps you were right. Perhaps tonight you have just spoken your own prophecy." The chamber gasped again, a wave of whispers and shouts crashing into one another. Trump's mouth opened to retort, but for a second time, no words came. His silence, once his weapon, was now his defeat. And the crack in his fortress was no longer invisible. It was a fracture the world could see. Jasmine Crockett did not hesitate. The chamber was already shaking under the weight of the night. Documents exposed, witnesses revealed, Trump raging and faltering in equal measure. But now she reached for the final dagger, a second file, a second recording. Her hand pressed a button, and the chamber screens flickered once more. The silence that fell was not the silence of calm. It was the silence of a nation leaning forward, every heartbeat waiting for the blow. The grainy image sharpened. President Volodymyr Zelenskyy appeared, his shoulders slumped, his eyes heavy with the kind of exhaustion only war and betrayal could carve into a man. His voice, faint but steady, filled the room. "President Trump told me," Zelenskyy began, his words halting, thick with disbelief, "that if I did not agree to surrender territory to Putin, there would be another man to replace me. Another president for Ukraine." Gasps tore through the chamber. He swallowed, his voice breaking as he forced the words out. "I was given a choice that was no choice at all. Sign away my country's land or be stripped of my office. My people left with someone else to lead them. It was a choice no free leader should ever face." The chamber exploded. The gallery erupted with cries, outrage colliding with grief. Reporters' fingers flew over keyboards, their voices into phones frantic. "Zelenskyy confirms Trump threat." Lawmakers stood, some shouting in disbelief, others screaming accusations across the aisle. The chairman's gavel pounded like a heartbeat, but the noise only rose higher, louder, unstoppable. Trump's face drained of color. For a moment, he looked less like the raging strongman of minutes before, and more like a man caught naked under floodlights, every secret laid bare. His mouth opened, desperate to shout it down, to call it a lie. But Zelensky's voice continued, echoing over the chaos, impossible to drown. This was not diplomacy, Zelensky said, his voice tight with emotion. It was coercion. It was not friendship. It was blackmail. I was asked to choose between betraying my people or losing my presidency. That is not the voice of America I thought I knew. The words hit like cannon fire. Several lawmakers covered their faces. Others dropped their pens in shock. A senator's voice cracked as she muttered, "My God," her head shaking in disbelief. Jasmine let the chamber absorb every syllable. She did not interrupt, did not embellish. She allowed Zelensky's pain to bleed into the room, to carve its mark into history. Trump lurched to his feet, his voice rising above the uproar, cracked and desperate. "Fake! This is fake! Zelensky is lying. He's been told what to say. He's weak. He's corrupt. He's nothing without me." But even as he shouted, the recording kept playing. Zelensky's eyes filled the screens, red with fatigue, shimmering with quiet defiance. "I will not surrender my country. I will not surrender democracy. Not to Putin. Not to anyone. Not even to the President of the United States." The chamber shook with the force of it. A declaration that rang louder than Trump's protests, louder than the gavel, louder than the chaos. The gallery erupted into applause, cheers bursting through the tension, people on their feet, tears glinting in their eyes. Some lawmakers rose too, clapping defiantly, their hands striking together like hammers against stone. Trump's roar was lost in the storm, his denials scattered like ashes in the wind. And Jasmine, standing calm at the center of the whirlwind, leaned into her microphone, her voice low but devastating. "You just heard it, not from me, not from a witness, but from President Zelensky himself, the man you threatened, the ally you betrayed, the leader you tried to replace." She turned toward Trump, her gaze unflinching, cold as iron. "He has more courage in his silence than you have in your fury, and tonight his truth stands taller than your lies." The chamber gasped. Reporters shouted questions, the gallery erupted again, and lawmakers shouted over one another, their voices colliding in chaos. But the image of Zelensky lingered on the screens, his words echoing in the ears of millions watching at home. Trump slumped back into his chair, his face pale, his body shaking with anger and fear. His empire of denial was crumbling, his fortress was breaking apart, and for the first time, even his allies looked unsure. Jasmine stood tall, the storm raging around her, her voice carrying the weight of the moment. "This is not a partisan fight. This is not politics. This is about whether the United States will be remembered as the nation that defended democracy or the nation that sold it to a tyrant." The chamber thundered with shouts, but under it all, a new current stirred. One of inevitability, of history moving forward, unstoppable. The fracture had widened, and there was no turning back. Trump jerked forward in his chair, his face a mask of desperation and rage. His voice tore out of him in ragged bursts, less the roar of a lion than the howl of a cornered beast. "That was negotiation," he shouted, slamming his palm against the table so hard the microphone squealed. "You don't understand. I am the greatest negotiator in the world, a genius of deals. That's all it was, deal-making." His words spilled out faster, tangled, panicked. "You twist it, you spin it, you make me sound like a traitor. But this is how peace is made. Threats, leverage, power, that's what wins wars. That's what makes America strong." The chamber did not buy it. Instead of nods, he was met with stares. Instead of applause, there was silence. Not the silence of awe, not the silence of respect, but the silence of judgment. His hands trembled as he raised them, gesturing wildly, his orange-tinted face now glistening with sweat under the harsh lights. His voice cracked, the cadence no longer triumphant, but fractured, as if his own conviction was crumbling beneath the weight of his fear. "You call it betrayal," he said, his tone veering toward pleading. But I call it brilliance. Nobody would make deals like me. I saved this country once, and I will do it again. You can't take that from me. His eyes darted across the chamber, searching desperately for approval, for one loyal ally to rise, to defend him, to break the spell of his humiliation. But no one moved. Even those who had screamed in his defense earlier sat frozen, their faces pale, their mouths tight. Some looked at the ground, others at the cameras, none at him. The image on the screen behind him, Zelensky's anguished face, his words replaying again and again, loomed like a shadow he could not escape. Trump slammed his fist again, but it was weaker this time. Don't you see? This is what leaders do. This is how the world works. You pressure, you bargain, you replace. That's politics. That's power. But his words rang hollow. The master of spectacle, the man who once bent entire crowds to his will with bravado alone, now sounded like a parody of himself. His chest heaved, his shoulders sagged, his bravado melting into a kind of wild, frantic begging. The cameras zoomed close. The nation saw it all. The trembling hands, the darting eyes, the sweat. The cracks in the armor of a man who had once convinced millions he was invincible. Jasmine Crockett did not interrupt. She didn't need to. Every second he spoke, he damned himself further. And the chamber, lawmakers, aides, press, public, was no longer listening to a president. They were watching the collapse of one. Trump's voice broke again, higher now, shrill with desperation. You don't get it. None of you. History will remember me as the greatest dealmaker, the greatest president. I did what no one else had the guts to do. I told Zelenskyy the truth, that without me, without my strength, his country is nothing. Nothing. The last word cracked like glass shattering. Gasps echoed. Some lawmakers covered their mouths. In the gallery, a woman shouted, "Shame!" and others murmured in agreement. The chairman's gavel thundered, but the sound was drowned by Trump's own unraveling. He collapsed back into his chair, panting, his chest heaving. His eyes glistened not with anger alone, but with something darker. Fear. The fear of a man watching the world slip from his grasp, powerless to stop it. For years he had thrived in chaos, mastering it, bending it to his will. But tonight the chaos had turned on him. It was no longer his stage. It was his cage. And in that cage he looked small. Jasmine leaned into her microphone at last, her tone sharp, unyielding. Genius negotiator? She asked softly, her words dripping with controlled disdain. Is that what you call it? Threatening to overthrow an ally? Calling a dictator your only friend? Demanding land that isn't yours to give away? If that is negotiation, Mr. President, then the world has no use for geniuses like you. The chamber erupted in a storm of murmurs, applause mixing with outrage. But Jasmine's words lingered above it all, like thunder after lightning. Trump pressed his palms against the desk, his lips trembling, but no words came. His empire of denial had shrunk to nothing but sound and fury. And now even his fury was cracking. The man who once commanded silence with a glance, who once could fill arenas with chants of loyalty, now sat shaking under the lights, his power collapsing in plain sight. The reckoning was no longer coming. It was here. And Donald J. Trump was drowning in it. The chamber hung on a knife's edge. Trump's chest heaved. His hands trembled against the desk, his face pale beneath the glare of the lights. His fury had burned itself out, leaving only the wreckage of a man stripped bare before the world. And into that silence Jasmine Crockett rose. Her posture was straight, unbending, her eyes steady as steel. The folder lay closed before her, the damning evidence now less important than the truth it had already unleashed. She didn't need more proof. She didn't need more fire. She was the fire. Her voice rang out, not in rage, but in the steady cadence of judgment itself. You were not negotiating for peace, Mr. President, she declared, her words echoing against marble, heavy as hammers. You were negotiating for Putin. The chamber gasped, the words striking like a lightning bolt. Jasmine pressed forward, each phrase sharp as a blade. You did not defend democracy. You threatened to topple it. You did not fight for freedom. You plotted to replace it with obedience. You did not stand for America. You stood for yourself and for a tyrant who dreams of breaking nations. Her voice rose, filling every corner, every microphone, every living room across the country. And that, Mr. President, is treason. The word thundered through the chamber. For a split second, there was silence. The kind of silence that comes when history pauses to etch itself into stone. And then the dam broke. The gallery erupted first, applause shattering the stillness, echoing like waves crashing against cliffs. Then lawmakers rose, some clapping furiously, others pounding their desks in approval. The noise swelled, grew, became an unstoppable roar of hands and voices, drowning out the gavel, drowning out the shouts of Trump's last defenders. The cameras captured it all. Millions watched at home as the chamber stood to its feet, not in chaos this time, but in defiance. The image was seared into history. Jasmine Crockett, standing tall at the center, her hand pressed to the microphone, her face resolute, while the walls of Congress trembled with applause. And Trump? He sat, alone, slumped in his chair, shoulders sagging, his lips pressed into a tight, colorless line. His eyes, once blazing with arrogance, now stared downward, dark, sunken, empty. The cameras zoomed in. The nation saw not the strong man he once claimed to be, but a man broken, stripped of the illusion of power. His empire of noise had crumbled into silence. Jasmine's words still hung in the air, undeniable, irreversible. Treason. Trump did not answer. He could not. His fingers drummed nervously against the desk, his chest rising and falling, but no words came. No fury, no denial, only silence. For the first time, silence was not his shield. It was his prison. The chamber's thunder carried on, applause rolling like an ocean, applause not just for Jasmine, but for the truth itself. Cameras panned across faces wet with tears, across lawmakers embracing, across ordinary citizens in the gallery, raising their fists in solidarity. It was more than clapping. It was catharsis. It was the release of a nation watching justice finally speak louder than power. The chairman, overwhelmed, let the applause roll on. His gavel rested silent, as if even he knew history needed no interruption. Jasmine Crockett remained still, her hands steady, her breathing calm. But her eyes glimmered with the knowledge of what she had just done. She had not merely questioned a president. She had shattered him, and the world had witnessed it. Trump's final image lingered on the screens. A man slumped in defeat, his eyes dark, his silence louder than all his shouts combined. The cameras held that image, froze it, burned it into history. And then slowly, the broadcast faded to black. The hearing was over, but the reckoning had just begun. In the end, it was not the thunder of power that prevailed, but the quiet endurance of truth. One voice, steady and unyielding, proved stronger than 1,000 shouts, reminding us that courage is not the absence of fear, but the refusal to bow to it. This story teaches us that justice is never handed down by titles or thrones. It is carried in the hearts of those willing to speak when silence is safer. And in choosing truth over power, we become the guardians not only of democracy, but of our shared humanity. If this story shook you, don't just swipe away. Let it linger, share it, speak it aloud. Send it to someone who still believes democracy is worth defending. Subscribe to Harrison Stories, where every silence meets its reckoning. Turn on the bell, because the next chapter won't be easy. It will be raw, it will be fierce, and it may forever change how you see justice. This tale is a dramatization, born from real betrayals and real courage. Any resemblance is not coincidence, it is reflection. Thank you for watching. Justice isn't a gift, it's a fight. This is Harrison Stories.